Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and joining me today is astrologer Leisa Schaim, and this is your year-ahead horoscope and astrology forecast for Virgo and Virgo rising for the entire year of 2026. Hey, Lisa, thanks for joining me for horoscopes this year.
Hey Chris, glad to be here.
All right, so we would recommend watching the horoscope that matches your rising sign if you know your birth time, because the forecast will be more specialized for you if you do so. Although, if you don't know your birth time, you can also watch the one for your sun sign. So, we're going to give kind of a big picture overview of the major transits this year to give you an idea of what's coming up over the course of 2026. So, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So, here's the planetary movements calendar that shows where the planets will start at the beginning of the year and where they'll end up by the end of the year. And these are the major transits that we want to focus on for 2026. So the first one is that Saturn and Neptune depart from Pisces, where they've been transiting for years, and they move into the sign of Aries in January and February of this year, and then they form a conjunction in February. So this is moving from your seventh house of relationships to your eighth house of shared resources.
Yeah, so you've been, especially for the last few years since March 2023, when Saturn moved into Pisces, in kind of a season of life where there's been a heavier energy with regard to partnership, either with regard to your dynamics with your partner, if you do have a partner, or with regard to what's going on in your partner's life, or just general one-on-one interactions have been a little bit heavier to deal with. But that's moving on now, and those are moving into your eighth house, which involves shared resources, shared finances, other people's money, other financial topics like taxes, loans, debts, and mortality-related things like wills and inheritance.
Yeah, so I think this is actually really good news to start the year off of because Saturn departing from your seventh house is going to bring some alleviation of some setbacks and some heaviness that you've been experiencing in that department since at least March of 2023 when Saturn first moved into Pisces. Whereas Neptune departing from your seventh house is going to lift the veil in terms of some nebulousness and other things like that that have been in the sphere of relationships, all the way going back to 2011 when Neptune first went into your seventh house of relationships. So the biggest thing at the beginning of the year is just feeling the alleviation of that, but then having that energy move into your eighth house of other people's money, shared resources, and other things like that, which on the one hand could bring some setbacks or some restructuring or challenges when it comes to financial matters starting this year, although you would have already got a preview of what that's about last year when Saturn first moved into Aries, I think starting in like June, right?
Yeah, at the end of May, so basically June, July, August. And that actually peaked, especially in July, because Saturn and Neptune stationed pretty close together in Aries. So you will have gotten some sense of what that exact conjunction will be about as of last July.
Yeah, so in February especially, I would be careful because when Saturn and Neptune exactly conjoin, I think that's going to be the peak of what I've been describing recently as this sort of like reality distortion field that Saturn and Neptune are creating when they come together, where sometimes it's really hard to tell what's real versus what's not, or what's true versus what's false. And for you, because this is happening in the financial sector of your chart, I would just be really careful about financial agreements, especially around this time, because you may not have the ability to tell the difference between what's true versus what's false or what's real versus what's not. But that energy will start to dissipate somewhat once you get past February. So if you can hold off a little bit past that time, it might be a good idea in terms of financial agreements.
Definitely, I agree. And for some people, Saturn going through the eighth house will also have to do with, as far as the longer transit, will have to do with kind of depth psychological work. That can sometimes be Saturn going through the eighth, can be like facing your fears. It can also be around mortality related things. Like some people do like death doula training when Saturn's going through the eighth, for example. So there can be really constructive ways to work with this house.
Yeah, definitely. So that's our first major transit of the year. Then the next one is that eclipse season starts from February through March. And this is going to be an eclipse in Aquarius in February, followed by an eclipse in Virgo in March. And this is happening in your sixth house of work and health, as well as your first house of self, mind, and body. So for me, eclipses are always about major beginnings and major endings. And this set of eclipses seems to be especially in the health sector of your chart, focusing on health and bodily matters and just what it takes to take good care of yourself and keep your health in good working condition.
Definitely. Yeah, the first and sixth are both health houses, although they can involve other topics as well. So definitely it can be a time to get things checked out. If anything, sort of niggling concern arises, it's like check it out versus, just wait and see. It's also a time where you can do more proactive health habit things, like starting a new health routines, new exercise routines, new nutritional routines, and that sort of thing to take better care of your body. Eclipses in the sixth can also be about things involving pets if you have any, and also about your workplace. So either coworkers or people who do any work for you, and also just your job. And I'm anticipating another transit that's coming up when I say that, but it can also be changes with regard to your workplace.
Yeah, so sometimes like ending one job and starting another, or ending one chapter in a current job and beginning a new chapter, like getting a promotion, for example, could be coinciding with an eclipse in the sixth house, like that Aquarius one. And this will be the
Mhm.
beginning of a new series of eclipses in Aquarius over the course of the next year or two. So it's probably part of an ongoing process, what rather than something that happens all at once.
Definitely. And with the eclipse in the first, especially, I mean, we've already had a couple in 2025, so it's not a new one, but it's still going to be the first eclipse as Saturn and Neptune are leaving your seventh house of partnership. And so I think there can be a renewed focus on yourself with the eclipse in the first. If you've had to put a lot of attention on partnership issues because of Saturn Neptune being in Pisces for so long, this will be a renewed focus or beginning or ending with regard to like your sense of self or who am I apart from my partner or that kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so moving on, our next major transit is that the planet Uranus is going to it's going to leave Taurus and move into Gemini starting in April. And this is a move from your ninth house of religion and philosophy and beliefs, and it's going into your 10th house of career. So, over the course of this Uranus transit since 2018 or 2019, when Uranus is going through your ninth house, there may have been a lot of unexpected changes and new and exciting and innovative things and disruptive things that you've been learning and growing in terms of your beliefs and your outlook on life. But now that transit is coming to a close, and you're going to take a lot of those new things and new beliefs and new outlook, and you're going to start applying them to your 10th house of career and overall life direction in what should be a major shakeup, but a very good and essentially liberating one in terms of your career and life direction.
hmm Yeah, and in terms of that Uranus transit through your ninth house that is coming to a close, there will be one last hurrah in February as Uranus stations there for the last time in your ninth house in Taurus, and then a bunch of inner planets square that all month. So there'll be like a little capping off in an exciting way of that transit, but then it moves into your 10th house of career and public reputation. And that's a time usually where people do a lot of innovating with regard to professional work in terms of either the field that they're in. Sometimes they change, they go into like a new line of work. It can be wanting to work for yourself and starting to move in that direction and innovate and be more self-sufficient with regard to your profession. And that's kind of what I was thinking about when I said, the eclipse in the sixth house there's a little bit of a crossover there in terms of changes with regard to work.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because especially when you start having Uranus going through your 10th house, you're going to have much more of an internal drive for freedom and liberation when it comes to wanting to be in charge of the direction that you're going career-wise and just in terms of your overall life direction. So if there's some career or a boss or another superior that you feel like has been holding you back or stopping you from living your authentic self, especially career-wise, then you're probably going to get increasingly agitated and wanting to push back against that and strike out in your own direction as this transit begins. And then this is a long-term transit that's going to last through 2033. So it's going to be a process over the course of most of the next decade.
Yeah, definitely. So this is just the start of it. And there can be, especially with Uranus transits in terms of change in profession, it can be a process of experimentation because Uranus is like doing things suddenly or doing things unexpectedly. So you can kind of have sudden epiphanies of like, what if I did this with regard to work, and then maybe you try that, and then you're like, well, half of that worked, but half of it didn't. What can I try next? It's that kind of process over the next 7 years.
Yeah, and sometimes there can be unexpected disruptions that come out of left field unexpectedly that
Mm.
throw kind of a roadblock in our way or knock us off course that we weren't anticipating or that were things that came out of nowhere that weren't on the plan, where it's like there's something that didn't go according to plan, but sometimes that's necessary in order to push us in the correct direction or in the direction that we're supposed to be headed. So sometimes
Mm.
when that happens, the best thing you can do is just try to be as flexible as possible, try to think on your feet, and try to adapt to whatever the changing circumstances are. And if you can do that and maintain that flexibility, then you should have the ability to navigate towards some of the most successful outcomes.
Yeah, it can be a really exciting time, like possibly the most exciting of your life in terms of innovations around your professional life.
Definitely. All right, so that takes us to the next major transit this year, which is that the planet Jupiter is going to spend the first half of the year in the sign of Cancer, which is your 11th house of friends and groups and alliances. And then starting in late June, Jupiter is going to move into Leo, which is your 12th house of seclusion. So it's interesting because we start out the year with the first half with a more social transit of like expanding your friend groups, being very social, and having success as a result of alliances and friends. But then in the second half of the year, we move into a more introspective time of the year where suddenly you're having more success by doing internal deep dives into yourself and into things like mental health.
hmm Yeah, so Jupiter went in mid-year in 2025 into Cancer into your 11th house. So it's the second half of that transit in the first half of 2026. So expansion around, time spent with friends, expansion around groups that you belong to, around social activism, around things just generally in the social sphere, around community. But yeah, then as you said, halfway through the year, it then shifts into a much more internal space where you can either have success because you are working on a project behind the scenes or you're working on something that necessitates you working alone for a while. Um, or it can be more contemplative. Like it's easily a time where you have a lot more internal reflection, or a meditation practice can be really successful at this time. Trying new things with regard to, yeah, in your internal spaces is definitely the second half of the year.
Yeah, so sometimes when you have a really positive internal transit like that, it can be a good time to like start to see a therapist, for example, and do some internal explorations that way in terms of dealing with some of those things that arise where sometimes the 12th house can be like people we don't get along with in our life. And so a 12th house transit could be finding ways to reconcile or make peace with those people that we don't get along with. Whereas sometimes when we have a transit like that that's more internal, we can start to identify instances where we're sort of like our own worst enemy or where we've undermined ourselves, and then finding ways to fix that so that it doesn't continue to happen in the future.
Definitely.
Yeah, so that's that Jupiter transit that's taking place in the second half of the year, and then that's going to continue on into the first half of 2027. And one really nice thing about that transit is before Jupiter goes into Leo in late June, there's going to be a conjunction of Venus and Jupiter that's very auspicious earlier in June in your 11th house of friends and groups that I think would be a great final like party or like blowout with friends or something like that before you go into that more contemplative part of the year. And this Venus Jupiter conjunction is something we noticed because we just finished researching and released our 2026 Electional Astrology report, where we went through and picked out the most fortunate dates in the entirety of next year for people to use in planning for when they want to plan major things in their life over the course of the next 12 months.
Yeah, so basically important actions you want to take or new projects you want to start. It can involve anything like your love life or business or home. Basically anything you want to turn out well. You can use these dates and times to begin that action for better possibilities of successful results.
Right. So we've got 28 different auspicious electional charts and dates next year, along with tutorials. And the report includes a video report as well as an audio version, plus an extensive written report as a PDF that comes with it. So we're doing a launch sale where you can get it for $49.95, but only this month. And then the price is going to go up to $65 at the beginning of January. So if you'd like to get the report, you can get it now at theastrologypodcast.com/2026 report. All right, so that brings us to the second half of the year, where our next major transit is the second eclipse season happens in August and early September, where there's going to be an eclipse in Leo and then an eclipse in Pisces. And this is happening in your 12th house of mental health and seclusion, as well as your seventh house of relationships.
So this will be the first Leo eclipse in that series. We already got the first Aquarius one in the opposite sign earlier in the year. Now this is the first Leo one. So eclipses in the 12th house can bring beginnings and endings with regard to some of the topics we were already just discussing with Jupiter going through your 12th house in the second half of the year. So things involving seclusion, mental health, contemplativeness, um, yeah, basically behind the scenes work. There can be a beginning or ending with regard to any of those topics. And then interestingly, that Pisces eclipse is going to be the very last end cap of all that Pisces action in your seventh house of partnership and one-on-one interactions. So we've already had a series of Pisces eclipses there. We've also had the Saturn Neptune transiting there for the last few years. Especially. And so this will be like the last sort of end cap of a beginning or an ending with regard to personal or business partnership.
Yeah. And this 12th house eclipse, I think, harkens back to the sixth house eclipse that happened earlier this year during the first eclipse season, because the first eclipse was about more like physical health, whereas the 12th house eclipse happening in August and early September is more like mental health. So there's something about the relationship between mind and body that's coming up at this time that's part of the focus of this year, and where sometimes, you need to take care of your body because if you don't, sometimes that can impact your mental health in terms of your mind, and also vice versa. That sometimes if you don't take care of your mental health, then it can have a negative impact on your physical health.
For sure. And there can be crossovers between those two houses, as any two opposing houses often have some topics in common. So you can have mental health things come up in the sixth house. You can have physical things coming up in the 12th house. But there'll be attention being paid to both of those topics either way with that new eclipse series across your sixth and 12th.
Yeah. And then with the second eclipse happening in your seventh house of relationships, this is nice because even though we've had some eclipses there over the past year or two, Saturn was transiting through there since 2023, but now that Saturn is gone and we have the alleviation of the heaviness of that, this is not only ending that period so that you're closing that chapter of relationships for good with this eclipse, but you're also opening a new one. And there's a potential for new relationships to start at this time with this eclipse in your seventh house of relationships, or for you to start a new chapter in a current relationship if you're already in one.
It's definitely going to feel a lot lighter going forward at this point with regard to partnership than it has for the last few years.
Yeah, so that's great. Sometimes it's not about the thing that's starting or that's being emphasized in your chart, but sometimes it's just as much about like the something moving out of a certain sector of your chart and stop and having the not the negation of that, but having a lack of that happening anymore.
The alleviation in that area.
Yeah, that's the word. All right, so that takes us to our next transit, which is that there's a Venus retrograde transit in October and November that's happening in Scorpio and Libra, and this is happening in your third house of communication and your second house of finances. So for some people, this is going to be a very positive transit, especially if you have a night chart where Venus transits will tend to be some of the most positive ones for you. So this could stand out as really good things happening in the sphere of communication, siblings, your neighbors or neighborhood, as well as your second house of money and finances, which could be like a financial windfall of some sort.
Right. So Venus retrograding through your third can be things like having siblings or extended relatives that you haven't seen in a while come back into your life more closely. Um, and I like that it's going into your second house. It's an interesting, again, crossover with the eclipse in the sixth house and the Uranus transit starting in earnest in your 10th house. There can be something really positive here with regard to personal finances and how you make a living. So there can be a revisiting or a reworking of that, but there can also be something really positive going forward in that area after the retrograde finishes.
Yeah, definitely. But with all Venus retrograde transits, they're often backwards looking. So either there's something about reflecting on the past, or sometimes there's literally people from your past that come back into the present. And especially because the same Venus retrograde repeats every 8 years during the same part of the year, it's good to think back to 8 years earlier, which would be October and November of 2018. There could be some scenarios that happened during that time that could be relevant again today during this Venus retrograde transit, or even 8 years before that, which would have been October, November of 2010.
hmm Yeah, so some of those themes can repeat. If you remember back to what was happening around that time, it can give you clues ahead of time. Um, but yeah, so revisiting things with regard to like either old ways of making a living or old personal connections that were, integral to like how you made a living, i.e., like people you used to work with, maybe that kind of thing.
Yeah. And since Venus is crossing the third house and the second house, oftentimes I've noticed in recent retrogrades how it will connect or cross over those topics. So some crossovers we could kind of think of could be things like connecting events with your siblings and money. So that could be on the one hand like a positive thing, like maybe you start working with your siblings and you somehow make more money together doing some sort of shared project. The let's say a negative scenario could be like a sibling hits you up for money and you loan it to them and it creates like a tricky situation or something like that. That's going to
Mm-hmm.
vary depending on like if you have a night chart, you'll probably see more positive outcomes. If you have a day chart, it could be a little bit more problematic. It could also be a crossover between like making more money in terms of your neighbors or your neighborhood, or even in terms of like the third house is short distance travel, like driving. So I could see a
Mm-hmm.
scenario where, somebody starts driving to deliver things for like Lyft or
Right.
Uber or something, and then suddenly it increases their finances because of the connection with the second house.
Yeah, that was going to be my example too, for like DoorDash or something.
Right.
But yeah, things involving, yeah, those two topics together.
Yeah, so travel and finances, but just brainstorm some of those possible connections and also look at your past and those 8 year increments, and you may get a preview of some of the things that may come up this time.
I was going to say also communications and income, because that can be really widely applicable, like how you communicate or using your communication skills to like make more money or, get a new job or something.
Yeah, totally. And improving your communication skills, taking them to the next level could increase your income at this time, especially if you make an
hmm
active effort to do that.
Right.
Yeah. All right, so that brings us to our final transit, which is that Mars is slowing down towards the end of the year and getting ready to go retrograde. And it's not actually going to station retrograde until early January of 2027. But already Mars has entered its shadow and it's moved into the two signs that it's going to go retrograde in, starting from September through December of 2026. So this retrograde is going to take place in Leo and Virgo, which is your 12th house of seclusion and sometimes people you don't get along with. And then it's going to retrograde back into your first house of mind, body, and self. So Mars retrogrades can be kind of tricky because sometimes when a Mars retrograde happens in our 12th house, it can bring up relationships with people in our life that we don't get along with very well, and sometimes bring things to a head in terms of needing to address and confront and even like stand up for ourselves in some instances if there's somebody that's kind of like pushing your buttons or that's pushing your boundaries in ways that are not good.
Definitely. Yeah, that can definitely be a theme for some people when that transit happens. At other times, it can be, like we were talking about with the Jupiter transit through your 12th house and the eclipse there, there can be an extended period of time here of internal work, like literally working on yourself, working on your subconscious, working on your, perhaps misdirected, internal reactions to things in a way that becomes more constructive once you kind of, dig a little bit into, the behind the scenes of your own mind. And again, similar to the Jupiter transit, there can also be a time, especially I'd say if it's a night chart, if you have a night chart, it can be an extended period of time of working on things alone, solo, like working behind the scenes on a project that's going to take a while can be a thing. Health things can also sometimes come up when it's crossing the 12th and the first house, because those can both be health houses.
Yeah, that's true. And sometimes, again, re-emphasizing that mind-body connection between like physical health, which is more first house, versus mental health, which is more 12th house. So that the 12th can also sometimes do with like more chronic issues that you have to deal with
Mm.
over an extended period. And sometimes when a Mars retrograde happens, there can be like an issue that comes up that seems like it'll be a small thing at first, but if you don't address it sort of head on, it can get dragged out into a longer term thing. So it's a good idea to focus on things and not let things go during this time so that they don't snowball.
Because the 12th house can involve your subconscious, and especially if you have a day chart, but even if you have a night chart, sometimes Mars transiting, especially at taking a longer time to transit your 12th house, you can feel more internally irritable for reasons you're not aware of. And then all the more so when it moves into your first house. So that's something to be aware of, just like you may have an inclination to react more irritably to things during this time. And it's a good thing to try to be consciously aware of and like mitigate.
Yeah, because especially when Mars is like retrograde in your first house, you can feel like having more energy, having more fire inside of you, and also having more of a disposition of feeling direct with people and just starting to be more blunt and having the feeling of speaking your mind more often, which for some people that's going to be a good thing, is going to be constructive, especially I think for the night chart people. But one of the things you want to be careful about, especially with the day chart people, is that you don't overdo it and like become too forthright or start like spouting off to people or doing things that cause divisiveness or division in your life, because it could push people away or even in some instances turn people against you if you say things, that are hurtful. So that's a issue that you want to pay attention to, is just to be a little bit careful with that transit.
Definitely. And one more thing I thought of when you said the energy piece is, sometimes when Mars goes into the first, and especially if you have a night chart, it can be a constructive time to be more active physically. And you might like, be inclined to start like a new exercise routine or things of that nature, like more vigorously than usual. But don't get discouraged. Like once this is getting a little ahead of ourselves. It gets into 2027, but there's going to be an interplay between that going into your first, but then retrograding back into your 12th. And so it doesn't mean that, that it was like the wrong time to do that. There's just going to be an interplay between having that extra energy and then getting back more into that secluded mode, and then maybe reworking your ideas about going forward in a constructive way. And again, that gets into 2027, but it's starting during the last quarter of 2026.
Yeah, definitely. All right.
I
Well, I'm
just
going to
keep
stop.
going. We'll get into 2028 and
No, I am going to stop you right there. That is as far as we're going to go. So that is our horoscope. I think that's all the transits for 2026. We got to stop at this point, otherwise we're going to start predicting 2027, and then we're going to be here all night, right?
yes. Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so those are your major transits for 2026. So, as we said, if you need help planning and picking out lucky dates next year, get our 2026 Electional Astrology Report, which is on sale for $49.95, but only until January. So get it now at theastrologypodcast.com/2026 report before the price goes up. If you want to learn more about our approach to astrology and how we predict things based on birth charts, check out my Hellenistic astrology course at theastrologyschool.com. But otherwise, that's it for this report. So good luck in 2026, and we'll see you again next year.